So good evening, great to see everyone. I want to start off with a verse from the book of Joshua. לא ימוש ספר התורה הזה מפיך והגית בו יומם ולילה למען תשמור לעשות ככל הכתוב בו כי אז תצליח את דרכך ואז תשכיל. God, addressing Joshua after Moses has died, says, this Sefer Torah, this Torah scroll, should not depart from your mouth. You should meditate on it day and night so that you can guard and perform everything written in it, because then you will be successful and you will be wise. Now this verse, as you'll see a couple other sources I will cite in a minute, refer back to, is really the key first instruction to a generation that is going to transmit Torah and teaching to the next generation. Moses receives teaching directly from God. Joshua is the first person, if you will, who has the charge of teaching these things to the next generation without having heard it himself from God. And it's also strikingly a verse that we read every year on Simchat Torah. After we have finished going through the entire annual cycle of the Torah reading, it is as if the Torah, or in this case, right, the prophets, speak this back to us, that what we have just finished going through once, we now have to figure out a way to maintain going forward. Where I wanted to kind of anchor this conversation in this verse is how one interprets this verse, how one understands what the mandate is to make sure that the Torah doesn't depart from one's mouth, is, I think, actually at the heart of figuring out any question of who deserves a Jewish education. Or another way of saying that is, you can't answer the question of who deserves a Jewish education or describe what Jewish education looks like without first asking, what is Jewish education for? What is intended to do in the world such that we can design the right product and expect the right product to achieve that? Now, I think one of the things that's striking about Jewish practice and thought and education throughout all time is that there's always been this strongly democratic thrust to it. So back at the steps of Mount Sinai, we hear from God in the Torah, "Atem tihu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the language is pretty direct, unlike other cultural educational systems that will have an elite cadre of priests who hold on to all the education and followers who somehow look up to them and expect to be vicariously fulfilled through them. This is a different project. This is a project where everybody is going to be a priest and everyone's going to be expected to take a role. Now, that does not totally answer the question. It means that there's some kind of democratic expectation, but the question is, democratic expectation of what and for what? Here, there's a couple other texts that I think are interesting to reflect on. In one place in the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Menachot, we have a statement by Rabbi Ami, who says the following: even if a person only reviews one teaching, one small teaching in the morning, and one small teaching in the evening, he has fulfilled the commandment of Lo Yamush Sefer HaTorah Hazeh Mipicha. You have fulfilled the obligation of not having the Torah depart from your mouth by just doing a little bit of learning in the morning and the evening. You can imagine one of those calendars of 365 days of Jewish wisdom, and as long as you rip off that page, maybe you need 2 pages, not just one, you fulfilled the obligation of learning, right? This is one way of thinking about the democratic expectation, and it's a sort of standard of some basic familiarity with the tradition, but not necessarily actually something more ambitious than that. The next line in the Talmud goes further. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even if a person only recited the Shema in the morning and in the evening, only had that basic kind of liturgical acting out of Jewish prayer, then one has fulfilled Lo Yamush Sefer HaTorah Hazeh Mipicha. That also fulfills the obligation to make sure that the Torah doesn't depart from your mouth. Yet another model, where here we're talking about a much more basic level of, as long as people essentially know what to do as a Jew, how to act, how to follow the forms of being a Jew, that fulfills our obligation as parents, as teachers, in Jewish education. The last third of 3 sources in this little triplet then features a great scholar, the nephew of Rabbi Ishmael, asking his uncle, I have learned the entire Torah. Do I have to still study Torah? Or can I go on and study Chokhmat Yevanit? can I study Greek wisdom, secular knowledge? And Rabbi Yishmael, his uncle, responds to him, Lo yamush sefer HaTorah ze mipicha v'hagita bo yomam v'layla, the same verse, with the postscript of meditate on it day and night. Go out, he says to his nephew, find yourself a time that's neither day nor night, and that's when you can learn secular knowledge. This is a totally different mode of thinking about Jewish education, but this is not actually a quantifiable enterprise that aims to empower you to do a specific set of things, but this is essentially the language that you speak. It animates all of your thoughts, and it's pretty much impossible to be apart from it almost at any time during the day. Right? Now, just those three statements, you can imagine all kinds of different ways of slicing and dicing how a Jewish education plays out and who should have it. According certainly to the first two pieces there, you could imagine saying, what you need is an elite group of people who really know how to master the Jewish tradition, how to speak its language, how to apply it. But for the average person, actually, all we want and need is some basic competency, some basic familiarity. And even the third source, which has those high standards of day and night you should be learning, is, after all, addressed to one of the most famous sages, and therefore it might also be a very minimal requirement. I want to suggest to you that all of these three approaches are problematic to apply to our own day and age. And that's by way of reflecting on the fact that the mandate for Jewish education and what the democratic expectation of Jewish education looks like, I think highly depends on the environment in which one is in, and what we expect Jewish education to do to individuals who are in that environment. What characterizes our day and age that is highly different from many other times when Jews have lived, even as short as 50 years ago in this country, is we live now in a Jewish community without any boundaries and with limitless possibility for integration into the broader society. And put simply, it means that any one of us can decide tomorrow morning that we are simply walking away from Jewish practice, from Jewish commitment, from Jewish learning, and there essentially are no external or even internal consequences to that action. In that world, where it's no longer self-evident that you're a part of the group, I think the value proposition of Jewish education changes dramatically. And here's where I want to share one final text with you that I think gives us a window into another time and place that's much more similar to our own. This is a passage from the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Sanhedrin. It starts with a verse from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, a strange verse that is cryptic, which the Talmud here is going to try to expurgate. The verse goes as follows: On that day, his burden shall drop from your back, and his yoke from your neck. The yoke shall be destroyed because of oil. Said Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha, commenting on this verse. What does it mean? The yoke of Sennacherib, Sancherib, the king of Assyria, was destroyed by Hezekiah's oil, King Chizkiyahu, king of Judea, which burned in the synagogues and the houses of study. What did Chizkiyahu do? He thrust a sword into the door of the Beit Midrash, the house of study, and he said, anyone who does not engage in Torah will be pierced by this sword. Following this decree, a comprehensive search of the entire country failed to turn up a single ignoramus. There was no child, man, or woman who was not an expert in the laws of purity. Okay, now what's going on in this text? First of all, this is not, I hope you realize and take for granted, some kind of lesson in late Iron Age history or politics. Whenever you have a text like this, the rabbinic source is imagining some value statement through the mythic lens of history and of Tanakh in this case, and telling it through that language. So what are the Assyrians? The Assyrians are the people who show up in 722 BCE, wipe out the northern kingdom of Israel, deport all of its inhabitants, replace them with people from the countries that they deport those people to, and through their standard modus operandi of population transfer, completely erase national identity, and that's why we still refer to those people as the 10 lost tribes until today. In 701, Sennacherib, the next king of Assyria, comes to descend on Jerusalem, puts the city under siege, and seems like that is about to happen to the southern kingdom as well, and the Jewish people will essentially have their national identity erased. Miraculously, the attack somehow fails, Sennacherib goes back, and we're sitting in this room today. And the question that this text is asking is, why did that happen? What was it that led to the Jewish people concentrated in the kingdom of Judah at that time? What led them to repel that attack? And the answer in this text is, a war on ignorance is what repelled them. In the context of the potential totally dissolution of national identity and assimilation, the way you fight back against that is you empower every single member of your community to be knowledgeable enough to actually survive out in the open world with a deep commitment to Torah, to Jewish values, and to substance. And the striking thing about this passage is it doesn't say that what he did was set up a school or an institution for elites. What he did was he set up a framework of education that meant that even the most marginal members, right, even the children, knew the most marginal pieces of Torah, the laws of ritual purity. Essentially, there was a commitment to an entire population that was learning. Now that took a lot of oil, takes a lot of dollars in our own day, and part of what we're going to try to think about tonight is sort of how do we actually do that. But what I'd suggest to you when we think about Jewish education and what it does today, and what it means to be committed to the Torah not departing from our mouth, you have to think about the immediate context. And the immediate context today is one in which, I think, where you have infinite possibilities of advancement and no boundaries. The only way actually to be a Jew in the world who actually continues Jewish culture and Jewish substance and Jewish practice is actually to be empowered with knowledge. And I would think that the conversation around Jewish education and the forms that we take and how we pay for it always have to be focused on that goal of how we make sure that we maximize that and bring our contemporary version of the Mamelechet Kohanim, kind of kingdom of priests, to actually some kind of reality.
So thank you, and I want to thank Beit Rabban for hosting this. I've said it to a few other people. I think it says a great deal about the school and the community here that it would take on this topic in such a public way and provide a forum for it. So I'm thrilled to be here. So I want to talk briefly about the history of day schools with a particular question in mind. Is the crisis of day school affordability and accessibility something new? Something unprecedented in American Jewish history? Or have American Jews before faced a time when an intensive Jewish education felt financially out of reach to large segments of the Jewish community? The history of the day school movement as we know it today, offering a dual program of religious and secular studies, has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th century. There were certainly all-day Jewish schools in the United States before this time. For instance, in New York, schools affiliated with B'nai Jeshurun, Anshe Chesed, and Rona Sholem were founded in the early to mid-1800s as an alternative to Christian-oriented public schools. But most of these schools ceased operations by the Civil War as free public schools, and I emphasize the free, shed their Protestant biases and became more hospitable to Jews. Indeed, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the vast majority of American Jewish children were educated in public schools. The period between 1880 and 1916 did see the birth of 5 yeshivot, 3 of them in New York, patterned largely after institutions of traditional Jewish learning in Eastern Europe and created by immigrants in order to preserve a European tradition of Talmudic study. But it wasn't between the period between the 2 world wars, from roughly 1917 to 1939, that the number of new day schools quadrupled to 28, most of them in heavy populated New York Jewish neighborhoods, but also in other cities. So for instance, this was the time period that Ramaz was founded here in New York, that the Maimonides School was founded in Boston, really venerable day schools that continue until today. This period between World War I and World War II also saw a greater diversity in the constituency and ideology of day schools, including the first all-girl day school in New York, the first co-ed school, and also the first liberal Jewish day school, so schools being created outside of the Orthodox community. Most of these schools were run independently. They were sponsored by local lay leaders in the communities in which they emerged. Very few of them relied for financial support on Jewish communities elsewhere, and most of them were all-male institutions. 8 of the 28 new day schools were co-ed, and as I mentioned, only one was an all-girls school. The period 1940 to the mid-1960s was one of massive expansion in the day school movement. 271 day schools were established in the United States and Canada, including new networks of schools such as the Solomon Schechter schools, which were founded in 1957. These schools collectively helped to educate over 65,000 students. By the end of the 20th century, according to a census conducted by the Avichai Foundation, there were more than 676 day schools educating close to 184,000 children, approximately 80% of them in Orthodox institutions. Now, looking back into the literature on these institutions and looking back into the history of the day school movement and what people were writing about them in the late 19th, early 20th, and throughout the 20th century, there was never a time when affordability was not a foremost concern, and when proponents of intensive Jewish education did not worry that escalating tuition would make a day school education out of reach for some families, or that huge expenditures would make some schools unviable. Writing in 1966, for instance, during a period of tremendous growth, as I mentioned, the scholar of Jewish education, Alvin Schiff, noted, quote, "The greatest, seemingly insurmountable problems of the day school are budgetary. The lack of communal support, the staggering rise in the cost of education, the need for new construction, remodeling, and repair, and the inability of many parents to pay the full tuition fee are sources of daily anxiety for day school leadership. Parents have absorbed much of the rise of the school's operational budget through increased tuition payments. Friends of the day school movement contributed even more. Nevertheless, the gap between the cost of education and income is far from being closed." About 35 years earlier, in the midst of the Great Depression, observers of the Jewish community articulated concerns that resonate today. A report on the years 1931 to 1932 in the American Jewish Yearbook, which was essentially the almanac for the Jewish community published annually, a contributor describes, quote, "One of the most tragic aspects of the business depression was its effect upon some Jewish educational agencies. In May of 1930, he writes, an announcement was made that 8 Jewish parochial schools in New York, in which between 5,000 and 6,000 children were receiving a secular and a Hebrew education, were in danger of closing because of a dearth of funds. At a meeting of persons interested in these schools held in June, it was reported that only 25,000 of the 250,000 required to maintain these schools was raised," end quote. Indeed, writing in his classic 1918 study of Jewish education in New York, the great Jewish educator Alexander Dushkin observed, quote, "Jewish education is a voluntary system which can be based on no other power than that of the free choice of the individual. Because of the inability to exert the legal compulsion of the state or the clerical pressure of a centralized church, the problem of financial maintenance must necessarily be very difficult." Analyzing school financing in the early 20th century, Dushkin continued that, quote, "About 1/2 of the income in Jewish schools is obtained from tuition fees, building rents, etc., and the other half comes from a variety of uncertain and costly channels. The attention of the board of directors of most Jewish schools is occupied almost wholly with the task of obtaining this second half of the income." He then goes on to describe what he calls literally the evils arising out of this great burden. So on the one hand, anxieties about day school affordability are nothing new. And communal leaders, school leaders, and parents have always worried about how to ensure that schools would be financially sound and that this education would be available to all who wanted it. But there are 3 aspects of this current, and by current I mean the past decade or so, but about this current crisis that I think are unprecedented and that I'd like to highlight because I think they're important to consider in developing new and appropriate solutions. The first distinction on the school side of the scenario. Schools are facing unprecedented budgetary challenges, particularly given the ever-rising costs of healthcare for staff, of salaries that a truly professional and well-trained faculty require, and the boundless expenses for top facilities, curricula, technology, art, music, gifted and talented remedial programs that parents have grown to expect. Certainly, in previous generations, day schools had to concern themselves with staffing and facilities and staying competitive with the public school down the street. But today's personnel costs, on top of pressures to offer the best Jewish and secular education in town, are often at odds with the school's commitment to accepting any student regardless of their financial means. The second distinction. On the parent side of the scenario, most every other expense parents of school-aged children are facing today has gone through the roof. The cost of saving for retirement, cost of college, of buying a home, of real estate taxes. Looking back into the literature of day schools, the earlier material from the early to mid-20th century referred to ensuring that the poor and new immigrants had access. Later literature in the latter half of the 20th century refers to ensuring access for the middle class as well. What seems striking about this current crisis is how it is also affecting those at the higher tiers of the middle class. Dual career professional couples, many with advanced degrees and years of career life behind them, scratching their heads and wondering how they got to the point that if they send their kids to day school, they can't save for college or put money away for retirement, and also wondering if they should have chosen a more lucrative career path. Lastly, on the Jewish organizational side of the picture, Jewish communal organizations, foundations, and funding agencies face an ever-expanding landscape of needs and opportunities. There have been periods when funding day school education was extremely high on everyone's priority list. For instance, in the 1990s, when Jewish education of all varieties was regarded as the solution to the Jewish continuity crisis. But pressing needs arising out of the current recession and other educational programs such as Birthright Israel have eclipsed day schools as a priority in communal funding and problem solving. A few foundations, such as Avichai, have been at the forefront of trying to provide resources for schools and perhaps even more importantly, developing models for sustainable business practices and endowment development. And several federations are working to raise endowment funds for schools in their communities. But there needs to be a massive communal effort to ensure day school affordability and accessibility. The enterprise is simply too big, too expensive, and too complex to be shouldered solely by a few individual families, schools, and foundations. Thank
you. I should probably thank you, Rona, because I was wondering how I was going to get through my remarks in 5 to 7 minutes. You covered the first half, so thank you very much. Maybe what I'll do, given that Rona really gave a wonderful historical overview, and I get asked this question all the time, is there really a tuition crisis, or is this just another version of something the Jewish community has gone through for many years? So maybe what I'll do, since she gave a wonderful, I think, some historical context, is maybe start in the 1990s, and I'll start there, in the mid-90s. I'll start there because my colleague Marvin Schick published a study, a survey of day schools and of day school finance and affordability. And as I look over the work I'm doing, I looked at his report from 15, 16 years ago, the similarities were remarkable. The Jewish community at that time, according to Marvin's statistics, average tuition was somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000. Average tuition today is somewhere between $15,000 and $18,000. But the Jewish community, and those of us involved in the field, worry just as much about affordability in those days as well. So simply put, what's changed? One is the size of the pie has changed dramatically. Right? Today, the day school financial enterprise is a $2 billion plus enterprise. In fact, if you wanted to just drill down a little bit more, the 300 or so schools that are within the denomination range from Reform to centrist Orthodox, and by that I mean Reform in no particular order, but Reform, Community, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, Centrist Orthodox, that is excluding Yeshivas and Haredi schools, those 300 schools alone have an estimated $1.5 billion cumulative budget. And as a percentage of that budget, and Rona alluded to it, roughly 80% is raised through tuition. That leaves just in those 300 schools a $300 million gap. And if you included the other 374 schools, which brings the total to, I'll use Rona's number of 674, you could perhaps double it. I don't think it would quite double, but my point is we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars a year of systemic underfunding. So as I've said, what got us there? Just factually, tuition prices have more than doubled over the past decade. At the same time, wage growth has been virtually flat. That's one of the factors leading to the tuition crisis. The second part is that primarily as a result, I would say, of the 2008 financial crisis, the demand for scholarship has skyrocketed. This gives me a good opportunity to recognize and to thank two of my colleagues who are here tonight. So I want to recognize Harry Bloom and James Moshe, who are part of the YU Institute for University and School Partnership, and they've done tremendous work, partially funded by Avichai, on a benchmarking program. And they have published a terrific piece called Jewish Day Schools 2030, Applying Cutting-Edge Management Practices for Long-Term Sustainability. So, and there's right. So I'm making a plug for this piece, which all of you, I asked them to bring copies of this. It's a must-read, and it's on the table in the back. But I want to cite a couple of things that they found in the 40 schools that they surveyed, and which I can corroborate from 2 or 3 times the number of schools in the work I've done. And that's as follows. Here's a sobering statistic, or a couple of sobering statistics related to scholarship. In 2006-2007, in that school year, 35% of children were on scholarship. The average financial aid award was about $4,000. In 2010-2011, 46% of children or families were on scholarship, and the average award in the 40 schools YU surveyed is $6,000. I did the math on this, Harry, you may have done it already, but that's a doubling. So the tuition in those 40, financial aid in those 40 schools doubled from 2006 to 2007, from something in the $20 million range to something in the $40 million range. And again, if you roughly added a 0 to those numbers, that could give you an idea of the national picture. So order of magnitude, going from a couple of $100 million of scholarship need in the early mid-2000s to going to twice that level now. At the same time, and again, Rona alluded to a little bit of this, the sources other than tuition, the sources other than parental contribution have remained flat, or in many cases have declined. And those are federation funding and certainly governmental funding as well. Flat or down on a relative basis as a percent of budget, and probably arguably flat or down in absolute dollars as well. I'm going to skip some of the statistics since they're probably easier done with some sort of visual presentation, which I don't have. Let's talk about a little bit, just for a minute, about sort of contextual differences. And one of the things that makes affordability work so challenging is that the schools are vastly, vastly different. They're different community to community, and they're often vastly different within a community. The sizes are wildly different. 40% or upwards of 40% of the 300 schools that I cited have under 125 students. And of course, we all know examples of schools with 1,000 or more students as well. What's interesting, a couple of interesting statistics. One thing that I always found very interesting is that the cost per student in a small school, which you would think, given the size, the cost per student would be greater. In fact, it's not. The cost per student is remarkably similar regardless of size. What is dramatically different is the amount of tuition raised in those schools. That is to say, for any number of reasons, smaller schools do not capture as big a percent of their budget from net tuition as larger schools do. And again, we can talk privately or in the Q&A about why that might be the case. But once you're talking about, so we've got the size differential. We've got dramatic denominational differences. And these days, frankly, the way that plays out is, for the most part, Orthodox schools run at 90% or more of capacity, certainly 85% or more of capacity, and generally non-Orthodox schools, there's generally a 5 to 10% gap in occupancy in those schools. The conservative movement in particular, some of those statistics are very, very sobering. The number of shelters that have closed, and from an affordability and sustainability perspective, the number of schools that are less than 70% full is very troublesome. Having painted a sort of sobering picture, let me just spend the next couple of minutes, and with that I'll wrap up, on why I'm actually fairly optimistic. I'll say cautiously optimistic. Number one, I think the issue of affordability and school sustainability is firmly on the Jewish communal agenda. I think that's happened in a relatively short period of time. And as evidence for that, I would sort of cite the following. When I was hired by the Avichai Foundation to head up the day school finance area, that was the first time Avichai touted my hiring as that I was the only full-time professional working on day school affordability. At a minimum, PEACH, the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education, and the OU have brought on one or more people full-time. The foundations are waking up to this challenge. Our colleagues at the Jim Joseph Foundation, the Kohelet Foundation in Philadelphia, just to name a couple, two foundations that we have partnered with in the past, are very focused on day school affordability. I would say that there's an entity that's called Affordable Jewish Education, another foundation that just started in the New York area that's focused in particular on thinking about low-cost alternatives. And I will invite someone or someones to ask me a question about these low-cost yeshivas that are opening, such as Yeshiva Atid. I'm not going to cover it in my formal remarks, but I'm inviting you to ask me about it in the Q&A. I'm seeing from my perch tremendous efforts underway on both a communal and a local level toward parental affordability and day school sustainability. There are efforts underway in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Montreal. Montreal has raised $50 million from 5 families to create a middle income and excellence program in their 8 or 9 yeshivot. That's a relatively small place, Montreal. That's a lot of money. The Metro West region has raised over $50 million of endowment money for their 3 schools. Bergen County has an entity called NNJ Kids. The acronym is so long I can't even begin to pronounce it, but we'll call it NNJ Kids. It's a communal funding initiative. And this is an entity that started out trying to shift the burden of day school tuition away from the payer model, that is the parents, and more toward a shared communal responsibility, playing to some of the things that both Ethan and Rona that spoke about. NNJ Kids shortly will announce, that they're taking some much more dramatic steps. They're looking to see how they can actually work with all the day schools in providing much of their scholarship money and centralizing the scholarship piece. So even though the picture may look bleak right now, I think there's evidence that in some ways we're at a trough and things are looking better. The economy could frankly be a big shot in the arm that we've all been waiting for. There are already signs that fundraising in the Jewish world has picked up. Most fundraisers will tell you that 2011 was actually a really good year, and a lot of Jewish organizations would tell you that, and a lot of schools would tell you that they had far better years in fundraising in 2011 than they did in the prior couple of years. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. I guess we'll open it up for questions. I have a list if no one wants to venture. Well, let me start out by reading a quote that I read last week on the website of the Jewish Week, which had an article about this event, a brief article. And I don't know who wrote this, it was an anonymous quote, but I think it gives a sense of what this situation means to families. My school's tuition assistance application asks if you belong to a country club. Do I laugh or do I cry? It should ask if you can afford to invite people over for Shabbat dinner, or if you can afford to feed your family kosher meat, or if you can afford shul membership. My children do not go to summer camp. They have never had a music lesson or a sports lesson or a tutoring session, even when it was needed. Sadly, I've been priced out of my own religion, but luckily it's not so easy to let go of being Jewish, so we do what we can at home. So I think that sort of gives a sense of, that it's been told that this is taking on some families. I'm wondering if you guys want to reflect on where we are.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it raises a very important point that this issue of day school affordability also needs to be looked at in the context of the broader issue of affordability of being Jewish today. And I'm going to recommend a terrific article on this by Jack Wertheimer, which was published, he's a historian at JTS, and it was published in Commentary in 2010, where he really breaks down the different aspects of what it means to be an active member of the Jewish community and the price tag associated with synagogue membership and eating kosher and sending your kid to school. So I think in terms of how we problem solve, I think this problem and this challenge also needs to be looked at within a broader context of the other costs that families bear that are very, very real costs if they're going to be active and committed members of the community.
So maybe I'm going to pick up on one aspect of that. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that comment, and it's I didn't see it, but it's very well articulated. But I'll pick up on one aspect, which is this notion of, who should get scholarship, and is it right? And should the full payers be looking over their shoulder and asking what usually are very, very invasive questions? So I'm just going to throw in a very interesting statistic. The reality is, and YU's work was instrumental in uncovering this, is that a significant minority and possibly majority of day schools underprice full tuition for everyone. And by that, what I mean is that if everyone in the school paid full tuition, the school would still not make its budget. And so very often in private conversations, when someone says to me, I know the reason my tuition is so high is only because I'm subsidizing someone else's child, I'll look at them and say, the truth is, the likelihood is you're actually getting the subsidy too. So just to sort of frame that issue a little bit.
Should I bring the mic out to the audience, or I have a long or stand up?
I just wanted to throw one other cost into the mix that I know a lot of families struggle with, because it's not a financial cost, but it is a sacrifice of something that I think is part of raising a Jewish family, which is the decisions that you have to make in terms of earning enough to be able to pay for Jewish education versus being home with your children and spending time with your children and raising your children. And by paying for a Jewish school tuition, actually sacrificing some of the Jewish education that you're able to do on your own in your home, because you're just not able to be as present because you're working so hard. So it's not quite a question as much as it is an observation, but I would love some contextualization.
I'm not sure if this is contextualizing it, but I mean, I think maybe I'll just sort of echo the point. I think one of the ways that that's playing out is that the second spouse, and I'll say typically the female in a family, the mother is, I think, looking at that financial equation and saying, okay, great, do I go out and get a job that pays me X dollars, and after tax it's 2/3 of that, and then I need to hire a babysitter to pick up my kids from school? Or do I approach the school and say, you know what, you have a very nice tuition remission policy for staff, I'd like to work here? And I think, at least in some of the schools, the Schechters and some of the modern Orthodox schools in particular, when you see this, you've seen this phenomenon for years, frankly, in the more right-wing schools, where parents, and again, typically mothers, are working in the school for that very, very reason. And again, I'll cite my colleague Harry Bloom, who's done some very good work on looking at, well, what's the real cost of tuition remission? Just another sort of interesting tidbit, most schools don't count that as a cost. And if you actually added in the discount that so many kids get whose parents work in the school, you'd come up with a vastly different conclusion about what the real cost structure of the school was than if you didn't add that in.
Just two reflections on the two last comments. And I think one of the things I think we even talked about this, Rona, when we were doing some run-up prep for this. There's another phantom addition to cost for a lot of families, at least certainly when you compare it and you fill out the background due to the interwar period, which is, I know the way my father grew up and my father-in-law grew up was they got the day school education and their sisters did not. So a family was very committed to day school education, but that meant like you saved up for the boy to go to Yeshiva day school, and it was sort of assumed that that would be okay, it would work out. The daughter would marry someone who got a day school education, right? That aside from having certain problematic features on its own right, also just doesn't wash anymore. It's one of the things that has sort of played out across all the denominational boundaries. That's basically accepted as not the modus operandi anymore. But that sort of raises it, it goes to some of my comments about when you have a more democratic commitment to education, it in fact becomes more of a burden, almost to the point of unreasonable. I think the other thing about your comment, which I struggle with this as a parent in terms of just allocating my own time, is definitely, I think this is again sort of from a value substance perspective, the school is not really designed to be, nor should it be, the proxy for the transmission of Judaism and Torah, right? And so the question is, how can it be a key, even the key central player partner in that? But I think, again, I think it's important that you're raising that other piece, aside from just the question of how do we get everyone Jewishly educated, there's then the further question of that, the element of that that's done by the school, but then the element of that that's done by the parents. As you said, it was a comment. It's not so much a strategic response, but I think 100% that has to be kind of front and center on our radar screen.
I guess I'm curious, like almost more about taking a step back and saying and asking about the motivation of families as to why they choose a Jewish education. And I'm sure it varies across the spectrum, but almost sometimes almost ask ourselves, is it more of a cost of membership of the peers that we would like our children to have going to school? Is it sometimes language? Or is it the Judaic studies themselves? And has that changed? Is when people look at the cost of Jewish day school, are they really looking at really the training or more the setting that they're trying to set up for their children outside of what we typically think as Limudei Kodesh or Hebrew? I'm just curious of your thoughts if it's changed or what or if that's being looked at as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, look, speaking on a personal level, where my kids have gone to 2 different day schools, I've got to know 2 different communities. It's so particular to the parent and to the community. I think there's tremendous variety, even within one school, for various reasons why people send their children to day school. For some, it is an extension of a home life, and there's no alternative. It's a necessity to create literate children. For others, it's because they don't necessarily feel they could provide that training that they know they want their children to have, that they don't have their knowledge. I think it really runs the gambit. I think from my own research, looking back historically, it was incredibly interesting. So when I talked about this earlier period in the 19th century before the Civil War, when these Jewish schools opened up, that wasn't so much about giving a Jewish education. That was more about not giving kids a Christian education by sending them to the public schools. I think earlier in the 19th century, later in the 19th century, when you have this influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, again, initially, the idea of sending them into a setting that didn't provide that traditional Jewish education would have been unheard of. What's interesting is over the course of the 20th century, how it begins to change, how there was this tremendous love affair with the public school and a real tension over sending kids to day school. On the one hand, wanting to give them this intensive holistic education. On the other hand, there was a lot of opposition to day school education in the 50s and even into the 60s by federations, members of the Jewish community, who were afraid it would stigmatize Jews, set them apart. So it really, it changes a lot over time, and I think even within any time period, especially now, there's great variety, especially when you're talking about communities outside of the most Orthodox communities.
So I think Rona answered the question very well. The only thing I might differentiate, frankly, between Orthodox and non-Orthodox schools. I think it's fair to say that for the most part, in the Orthodox world, it's taken as pretty much a given that kids will be in day schools. I will put an asterisk there and note that even within the Orthodox system, parents are starting to question the proposition, looking for lower cost alternatives, looking at charter schools. We know statistically some, still a relatively small number, but more than zero, are availing themselves of these other options. So it is slightly eroding in the Orthodox community as well. But in the non-Orthodox community, I like what Rona said, there are a multitude of explanations. There is, I believe now, a dialogue going on the Avichai website, I think it's on the Avichai website, with non-Orthodox, around non-Orthodox day school education, probing people's attitudes and views, reasons for going, reasons for not going, and it's a very interesting, it's a kind of a robust dialogue. But I think the bottom line of that dialogue is, it's everything and everything. Affordability is often maybe cited as the #1 reason, but when you probe deeper, its values, its competing interests, its excellence of education, it's a wide variety of things.
I would just jump in and say, I think, some of this, it's very frustrating to me actually when some of those different motivational threads are not untangled one from another, because I think, for instance, if your goal is to give your child just sort of a sense of Jewish identity and being a part of the group and feeling good about being Jewish, I'm not sure that, trying to cram that into a full-day educational model 9 months a year is for sure the only way to do that. As equally as I am totally sure that if you actually want to educate your kid with skills and knowledge, you cannot do that by sending them to summer camp for 8 weeks. It just doesn't add up, right? Like the different things that you're trying to do, that doesn't mean there aren't creative ways to do it within that. But I think we need just sort of some more degree of clarity and honesty of what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And actually, there are certain things that an intensive education, and particularly kind of an integrated education model, are the only serious things out there right now for accomplishing. And that goes back to, right, what does it mean to commit to the Torah scroll, not the part of government math, right? Like for what purpose and what periodicity. And I think it would help things a lot if we could break that down a little more and talk about those different motivations.
I guess my first question is, why am I the only person in the front row? But I want to follow up with the rabbi's clarity and honesty. If we look at it from a purely market point of view, isn't it possible you're not offering a very good product? That if you were offering a better product, people would pay for it. And that if you were offering a product that really does all the things you say it should and could do, we wouldn't have this problem because people would say it's worth it to me. And isn't part of the problem this idea that the Jewish community has gone down this road of saying there's really only one right way to do this. And it's called day school and it's expensive, so you better pay for it. And isn't it possible that there are other alternatives, that a summer camp experience actually can do a lot more than 9 months in certain schools? And then when you look at the product you're offering, do you ever think about maybe we're not offering a good enough product, because if we were, people would be more than happy to pay for it?
It's an excellent question. Look, my purview is more the financial piece, and less the sort of the values equation. I would tell you in the surveys I've seen, again, particularly in the non-Orthodox world, quality is generally not, it's not flagged, it's not framed typically in terms of lack of quality. I mean, I'm not saying that no one has that feedback, but I think Rona alluded to it, and we debate this a lot internally at Avichai, but I think there's at least consensus that if day schools aren't at least materially better from a quality perspective than they were 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, then they're certainly at a minimum serving a more diverse group of learners, let's say. So I think they're appealing to more people. I do personally think that the quality, I didn't drill deep into the the reason the budgets have tripled in the last 15 years. But I do think one is that there's better quality, teachers are better compensated, there are more, as Rona articulated, a lot more extras in the schools. I do think it's competing values. In other words, and if you look in areas where day schools are, suffering, or when you ask parents, why haven't they will cite an excellent secular school. That's often more money, frankly, than almost always is more money than the local day school. Or they'll cite an excellent public school. In the Boston schools, Boston is a community that has excellent public schools. So good that there was an effort underway that didn't get very far to basically create a hybrid model where kids would go to the Boston public schools for the first 6 years, and in 5th grade or in 6th grade they would go back into the Yeshiva schools. The concept was to save those many years of tuition. But I would say in the research that I've seen, I don't see quality or lack of quality as being perceived value. I frame it as perceived value, but the lack of perceived value is not generally because of quality. It's competing interests, it's cost, it's a variety of things.
Just one other response to that. One of the models helpful for me thinking about this is thinking back to my undergraduate years, and you could take a course about French literature from Tuesday, Thursday, 10 to 11. But if you wanted to take French, you had to spend 4 mornings a week, 2 hours, right, straight through, and sit in the language lab listening to tapes, etc. And those are basically, right, it's 2 totally different products, 2 totally different things you're trying to get. And I think that's sort of the piece that I think is sort of important to highlight. Like, I would push, and part of what I was sort of pushing my opening remarks is, I think more of us need to be speaking more French. I think that in the Jewish community, for the Jewish community of today to be the Jewish community of tomorrow, we need more people that are speaking that language of Jewish culture, Jewish substance, Jewish text, etc. And that's simply going to require more time and investment. But for sure, I think it's important to make that case. You also need to be able to recognize that if someone did not want that product, and they're not interested, they just want the sort of, a different sort of take on that, then yeah, that may create a different product.
Right? It's just a quick follow-up. It's just the product itself. So for example, I'm going to give away my age. In the 70s, the after-school programs, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, was a disaster for most of us. I don't know what the situation is today. I've been told by some parents there are some terrific after-school programs, that it's not the 1970s anymore. And maybe one way for the Jewish community to deal with this affordability is to have a wider spectrum and to say that there are things other than day schools that can give you a big bang for your Jewish buck.
I think it does that, and I think there has been a tremendous amount. I pointed this out in my talk. There was a study that came out in 1990, the Jewish population study, which reported on escalating intermarriage rates and high rates of assimilation, and that scared the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, a great deal. There's a tremendous amount of money, time, effort, and thought poured into Jewish education following that report. It certainly had been done before, but this feeling that we need to upgrade not just day school education, but supplemental education, family education, adult education, etc. And I support that strongly. And I think that is absolutely what is going on. But at the same time that is going on, there is this model that can't be sacrificed while these other less expensive imported models as well are also being supported and bolstered.
Well, I think continue on this sort of thinking, and also about Ethan's comment about democracy. You think about, some people talk about, the people get the democracy they deserve. And, it's kind of a bit of a vicious or virtuous cycle where if the product was exceptional, and people sort of, you talk about excellent schools and quality doesn't come up with the survey. Because, well, if you're comparing between 2 really good options, why would you choose the option that is $20,000 or $15,000? Whereas if you're choosing between an option that is good and an option that's exceptional, then I think you might see more Jewish families say, I'm going to sacrifice the vacation. I'm going to sacrifice this. I'm going to take the more demanding job because this is something exceptional for my children. I think the challenge is that most people don't have that exceptional choice, at least from my limited, purview. But and it goes back to the question about democracy, is that have we demonstrated to people this is something you must have, or you want it? In spite of that law, are we creating the demand?
And we get in private conversations.
And I would argue it's no different for the schools that people are over the moon are. Or is there a qualitative difference for those schools that you consistently hear from families that cannot imagine sending their kids to other schools? So I would just challenge the panel a little bit, it's sort of like the iPad phenomenon. Did people know they needed an iPad? No, but once it came out, they couldn't imagine living without that. And do we have that in the day school world?
They're getting iPads.
I don't know, it's sort of thinking what we've spoken about.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, hard to ignore it, so there's two people that I know and respect have raised the issue, even if one's sitting by himself in the first row.
The gentleman said.
Again, look, again, the Orthodox schools for the most part, not entirely full, and there is a variety, but, the schools for the most part are full. And again, when you look, I guess a typical conversation that I might have with a non-Orthodox family about why their children are in a day school. I mean, if your assertion is that SAR Academy, where my kids go to school, or Orthodox school, but I'll use them as an example, a highly regarded school did families put, if you're looking at SAR and Horace Mann, right, which is a mile away, is SAR going to ever be of the caliber reputation of a Horace Mann? And yet, my point is simply that I think if you looked at the families, that you'd see a wide variety. I mean, people choosing excellent public schools over a day school, or choosing an excellent private school that's more expensive over a day school. I just don't know. I don't know that it's realistic to think that if you want to talk about quality and you think that's the driver, you'd be pushing the cost of that product, even higher than it already is. I don't see how we would do that, frankly.
I think if I don't call my wife, I'll be in big trouble.
Well, I was just going to say, so I'll just give a plug for Beit Rabban, which is where my kids go. And yeah, I think it's wonderful. I'm thrilled to have them here. It's a great product. And what you said about taking French versus taking French literature, I want my kids to be taking French every day, the equivalent thereof. But at what point do you feel like in teaching your children to be good Jews and learn how to be Jews and learn everything about Jewish culture and Jewish language and Jewish text, at what point is it irresponsible because you are, for the sake of their futures and their Jewish development, their on the ground practical, their security and stability is truly threatened on some level. I mean, it's great that all these initiatives are happening and that, in the future, things are maybe looking brighter, but for the families who have to pay the tuition bills this year, and don't want to say, okay, I'm just going to take off a year or something like that, and, save my diets or whatever.
5 or 10.
Right, you can't do it. So, I mean, I just think I think for certain families, there is a feeling of, this is a huge, I definitely want this, but you feel it every day.
Well, you phrase it perfectly, because I think it's the question, and Jack Wertheimer writes about this in his article, is how do we make a day school education a birthright, conceived as a birthright of every kid who wants it? There are other programs, for instance, Birthright Israel, that are conceived that way and that have had tremendous success, much less expensive, though, than a day school education. But I think the quote that you read earlier points to this too. For those who want it, I think it really does take the community, however we're defining it, viewing this as a necessity, as a birthright, as an entitlement for every child. And I'm curious to know from those who are experts here about, let's say, in the traditional Orthodox community, where that is essentially the case. You have families with multiple 5, 10 children who know they are going to send their children to an intensive Jewish school. I suspect the reason they're able to do it is those institutions are much more modest. They don't have fancy art and music programs. The facilities are much more modest, and that the fundraising model is very different in that the fundraising is not just from the local community, but the fundraising is from a much wider, if not an international community. So I actually, if I could sort of jump onto your comment and raise the question to the experts in the room, if that is a model where we have Jewish education as a birthright and entitlement, how does it work? Yes. The gentleman who seems to know.
So I guess I have three things I want to say, and if I may come back to you.
Yeah, sure.
I want to comment on this point about quality. I live in Boston, and there were two pieces of research in Boston that I think are instructive. One was the best market study that I've seen, which basically segmented all the potential customers, parents for Jewish day schools. And there was a category called believers. So the believers were the ones, no matter what, we're going to send our kids to day school. That's the category. Then there was one called best of both worlds. Best of both worlds, about 20% of the population, probably the proximate segment that was on the fence. And what they said was, we will send our kids to Jewish day school if we can have the best general studies program and the best Judaic studies program. And they rated, in their hierarchy of importance, math and science quality as top of what they cared about as the litmus test of quality. And they rated Jewish day schools as poor, weak in perception in that area. So what is Boston doing? They're putting on programming, and I've worked in schools that are really focused on augmenting and improving the math and science to cater to this market. So that speaks to, yes, there is a quality issue, but the same community did a study that basically said that the middle income is being squeezed out from an affordability standpoint. In other words, they identified a big slice of the population that would go to Jewish day schools, but they can't afford it. And if you look at percent of adjusted gross income that people earning, I don't know, in Boston, if you don't, $150,000 is, lower middle income, right? But if you're earning $150,000 and you've got 2 or 3 kids, that's a huge chunk of your income. So I think the answer is it's both. And so Boston is putting together a middle income affordability program generated by public funding from the Federation. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think we have to do both of those things. Now, in terms of the question about sort of the must-go segment, so we're working in our program in 5 communities. One is Baltimore. Baltimore has a lot of the, to the right, right-wing schools. So there's one that really intrigues me, and Dan and I have talked about, Beit Rabban of Baltimore. Beit Rabban of Baltimore is the largest private school in the state of Maryland. It has 1,350 girls in it, and it is bursting at the seams, and offers an incredible array of subjects in general studies, and as far as I can tell, pretty darn good education. And their tuition may be, $8,000 to, $10,000, $11,000. So even recognizing the lower cost of living in Baltimore, it's a deal, right? And so how do they do that? Well, they pay their teachers a heck of a lot less. As Dan said, tuition remission is a huge factor, all right? So many people working in school. But they have figured out how to offer a lot of value for little dollars. And I think there's something to learn from them. And I, as part of my research, or our research, is my colleague James, who's a chairman of it, is to try to understand, how do we make our schools more efficient? Because if you can take $1 of cost out, that's like generating these days $6 at a gallon, right? So I think we have to do all these things. I'm sorry to be rude.
So just picking up on the question of communal responsibility for the philanthropy side, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how the other piece of this conversation that strikes me as missing is conversation about tzedakah and communal, and particularly in our generation, sort of bringing that back as a topic of discussion. I'm from Montreal. Like you mentioned, a community that does a great job of fundraising, and I know that, from my parents' generation, and even from my generation, it's within the community, and part of this is being in a smaller community, knows where to give and what to give. And that you give within the Jewish community is important as part of your status within the community. To the earlier question of the cost of being a Jew, part of the cost of being a Jew should also be giving back to your Jewish community. For those of us who are sort of in the thick of struggling with affording our own kids' tuition, it's obviously a difficult time to also be thinking about how we can be giving back for everybody else's children's tuition. But it strikes me that that's sort of a communal conversation that generationally has been lost, and certainly in large Jewish communities like ours.
It's interesting because I think part of the issue, I'm not sure when or how this happened, but that the decision to send your kid to a day school, at least outside of the Orthodox community, seems to have become this individual choice. And so rather than it being viewed as an investment in the Jewish community, a communal investment in its future leadership, I feel like when I read the literature on this decision has become an individual choice, which I think when it is couched in this language of individual choice, it somehow becomes separate from the Jewish agenda, which already has a wide range, a multiple of 100 range of opportunities to give compared to, let's say, 50 years ago. You can give to a million different causes that have different connections to Jewish life and culture, which is wonderful in a way. But I feel like this has become about individual families' decision to do this for their family and somehow removed from the language of communal responsibility. Not on the level so much of federations and foundations, but I think, as you describe it, like tzedakah, what individual families give to.
I think also our philanthropy has turned outward.
Yeah.
As Jews, we give to non-Jewish philanthropies, which I'm not suggesting that that's not a positive value, but it also shifts where our dollars go and where our focus is.
Right.
So is the case being made to the larger community, the value of day school, that as an essential, is this case being made?
I don't think enough. I think and the larger point about education in general is, I think, there is no such thing that I'm aware of a universal system of education that is not supported by taxes, right? It's not a consumer product, right? Consumer product that you sell, that you're content to have only those who want to or can afford to buy it, is not going to be by definition universal. If there's some values thrust behind making something universal, it's essentially saying it's something that society is investing in. I'd be interested to talk offline either afterwards, but it sounds like there's also a little bit of a shift when you talked about earlier, kind of a 50-50 distribution of collection from tuition, if I caught it right, as opposed to things that the community was raising. And now I know organizations like PEACH, right, are like, oh, you're only collecting 80% from tuition, that's bad, it's got to be higher.
Right.
That may be right for the sustainability of the school. It's of course a very different picture in terms of who's stressing out at night and staying up. So there may be some conservation of stressing out that has to happen. But the question is sort of how it's distributed. I don't know, that would be another interesting.
There's also.
I think we have time for one more question.
I know the hour is getting late. I was just sort of hoping that maybe, Dan, if you could touch on some of the more exciting things that are going on in the conversation about what's going to, what are the most exciting things that are going on right now in the conversation about.
Right. So I think there are a lot of exciting things going on. I'm sensitive to the comment that it's not going to be in time for those of us. My oldest is in 9th grade. I'm not optimistic SAR is going to be more affordable within the next 3 years for me. Or as I like to joke, my entire Avichai after-tax salary goes to day school tuition, the entire piece. There are a number of things. Number one, and I'm just going to rattle off a few things. Number one, low-cost schools. Now lots of people have different views on these schools, but I'm thoroughly convinced one of the benefits will be competition breeds excellence. And in places like Bergen County, Yeshiva Hatid, which is a low-cost, essentially $8,000 a year yeshiva using a blended learning model, is going to, in my opinion, absolutely force the schools in Bergen County, which have already tightened their belts largely thanks to the work that YU is doing there in their benchmarking program, but it's going to force them to really keep their belts very, very tightly fastened. Sorry?
What is blended learning?
Sorry, thank you. Blended learning, online, as opposed to online learning, which is most schools aren't embracing a model that's just online. Blended combines sort of traditional frontal teaching with online learning. So in Yeshiva, Atid has embraced that. There's PCLC, which is a low-cost blended learning model in
Highland Park.
Edison, thank you, Highland Park. And then there are, I'm sorry? East Brunswick, thank you. Then there are 3 or 4 others that I'm hearing literally, more and more opening, Again, I think those at the end of the day will be just sort of very good for the full-cost schools to sort of kind of tighten their belts. Communal funding, which we talked about. There are a number of things going on. I cited NNJ Kids, Northern New Jersey, Kehilot investing in day schools, if you can remember that. It's an entity that's raised about $1 million over the last couple of years from primarily non-day school parents in Bergen counties, and has distributed that money per capita to the day schools. It's a drop in the bucket. There's tens of millions of dollars of annual budget in the day schools there. $1 million isn't exactly moving the needle, but they're beginning to think seriously about how they could really ratchet that up to a much higher level of fundraising and centralize the whole scholarship process, take some cost out of the schools by doing that, and relieve some of the burden. There are any number of local initiatives. The Sephardic community of Brooklyn has a small effort that's underway. They received a challenge grant from PEACH, and what they're trying to do is change the culture in that community. They have what's called a 60-60 program. The notion is they're trying to spread the message within a community that is generous and does give a lot of money, where a lot of the money goes outside of the community, to your point. 60-60 means 60% of your money should go toward local institutions of your tzedakah budget, and 60% of that should go to educational institutions, namely the day schools. Again, Harry and James oversee a benchmarking program whose objective is to achieve 10% budget improvement in schools, either through increased revenue or decreased cost, and they're achieving some very good success in various communities around the country. PEACH is where Avichai is sponsoring an endowment building program that is also in about 5 communities across the country, with the objective of raising $4,000 per child in endowment funds for the 35 schools that are in that program. I will say, having said that, these are very costly programs. If you looked at, for instance, enrollment, a 5-point improvement in enrollment, you could fill 5% more seats in a day school. You would move the financial needle. You'd bring in tens of millions of dollars into the system just by doing that. Obviously, easier said than done. But YU and others are creating initiatives and interventions around enrollment growth as well.
Thank you. Well, it's been a great discussion. I think it's time to relieve the babysitters. Anyway, thank you all so much. And thank you.